Besides the polar, West Fraser Lake shut down. You kind of go down the list. Taylor, Canfor, Chetwynd, L&M Lumber is operating on one
50%,
shift. We go back a bunch more years. 2012, there was West Fraser out in Houston shut down. So
West Fraser in Houston, and then Canfor shut down in Cornell. They made a swamp of logs. Hello, I'm John Brink, and we are podcasting on the Brink from downtown Prince George, British Columbia. Today, a very, very special podcast on an issue that is very current in British Columbia. It is the forest industry and a strategic change, or as some people would say, including myself, likely in crisis. And I have with me today very much an expert in the field. His name is Rob Schuetz. He is the CEO of Industrial Forest Service, a company that has been consulting forest companies across North America and in the world, but in particular in British Columbia. Started in around 1952 in a whole different looking forest industry, and has become one of the major companies in advising companies, governments, and independents on the future and whatever is happening in the forest industry. So, Rob, welcome to our show again under circumstances that are even more challenging than they were the last time.
Thanks, John. Yeah, it's nice to be here again. Yeah, it's been a lot of announcements in the last couple of weeks, and a lot of developments, I guess, in respect to forestry in British Columbia. And it's election year, so I'm sure there's going to be a lot.
October the 19th, right? In British Columbia.
In BC, so a lot of, I think, political maneuvering by politicians in that regard, and the message they're trying to send with respect to forestry and the path forward, I guess you could say, for the industry.
And I just want to mention to our guests that are watching, I'm not political. I've probably a middle of the roader. I'm looking at what is good for BC on the left or the right, and sometimes I support people on the left, not too far to the left, or on the right and not too far to the right. So I'm looking for what is good for us, especially in the forest industry in British Columbia. I love the province, and it has an immense potential and an immense future. Now, that what we have read recently is that another pulp mill in the Prince George region, or half of one, that is the Northwood Pulp Company, will shut down their pulp capacity, and that will eliminate about 220 jobs. And then the other announcement that was made is that the the Polar Mill just north, about 40 k's, 45 k's, 50 k's north of Prince George, will be shut permanently. That eliminates another 180 jobs, so that is 400 jobs here in the Prince George region alone. And to put that into perspective, what it means is that the multiplier is usually 3 to 1. For every direct job lost, another 3 indirect jobs are effective. So it could well be 1,600 jobs in the region. But then in addition to that, Canfor announced that the super mill they had in Houston that was shut down a couple of years ago now would be rebuilt, or they were planning to invest $200 million in a new mill. They have announced that they will not do that either. And so that probably, I'm not exactly sure, but it's probably close to 300 jobs in that region. But that's not the only thing in the region. There is value-added plants there.
Yeah, you have a plant there.
I have one there that has been there for 30-some-odd years, and all the attention has been on Canfor's plant, but we have not even got a phone call from the government or anybody else about it. It puts value-added in perspective, and it really pisses me off. Be very blunt about it and very frank about it. But that's not where we're going to talk about. But that means then for the Houston appointment alone, 300 jobs again, multiplier, 3 to 1, is probably 1,200 jobs in that region. Add to that Brink, Pleasant Valley remanufacturing, at least 75 jobs. Multiply 3 is 325, close to 300 jobs. In my books, that is significant, worthy of a, I nearly said the bad word, of a phone call, or at least saying, hey guys, we heard it from the truckers.
Yeah, yeah.
Shame, shame, shame. You know. So that in being said, so that is just recently, and the people are still trying to digest what it all means.
Yeah, well, first off, with respect to the pulp mills really, until about 2007, just before the big housing crisis in the U.S., most of the pulp mills in the central interior of BC, they just lived on a supply of residual chips. So they got their chips from the sawmills. Yeah. Then the housing crisis happens, the sawmills shut down, and they never really recovered. We lost a whole bunch of them. But all of a sudden, 2008, 2009, 2010, they're utilizing residual chips from the remaining sawmills, which were running probably at one shift, or a number of them had shut. And then they had pulp logs. But at the same time, we had the mountain pine beetle epidemic. And so there was pulp logs everywhere. There was standing
lots
dead.
of fiber, no problem, right?
And a lot of it was close to towns. So the pulp mills were able to capitalize on the fact that we got, the loggers were harvesting greenwood, they were harvesting deadwood. Supply of pulp logs coming into the pulp mills were fairly inexpensive. Right. And for the most part in this area, that pulp log supply lasted until about 2020, and then it's just started to peter off. Yeah. And now you go looking and you can't find dead pine trees anymore. If you can find one, there's about any of the ones around it, they're all fallen over and they're laying on the ground, or they've been harvested, or they burnt in the fires the last few years. Right. So the opportunity that the pulp mills had over the last decade to sustain themselves on a diet of pulp logs and residual chips isn't there anymore. And so we never really figured that, we weren't surprised when Prince George Pulp shut down. And even with that one down, there's still there isn't enough residual sawmill chips to feed the two. Actually, it's like 3 pulp lines or 3 digesters.
Simply it's not there, right?
And and you got but besides the polar, West Fraser Lake shut down. You kind of go down the list. Taylor, Canfor, Chetwynd, L&M Lumber is operating on one 50%, shift. Yeah. We go back a bunch more years, 2012, there was, West Fraser out in Houston shut down. So
West Fraser in Houston, and then Canfor was shut down in Cornell. They made a swamp of logs, right? Yeah. So I just want to, for the guests that are watching us and they're not necessarily used to me being only in the forest industry, because I do a lot of podcasting on all kinds of other topics. So I just want to give my guests a little bit of background, saying how come you know something about the forest industry. So I was born in 1940, so I'm 83, close to 84. My dad worked in the forest industry. My grandfather was a master carpenter, and I was not awfully successful academically. I failed grade 3 and grade 7 3 times. He said, what are we going to do with this guy? I've sent him to the mentally challenged school. No, let's get him a job so that he can work with his hands. So I got a job at 13 working in a furniture factory. I loved it. And I loved working with my hands, and then started there. The other one is, we were liberated this fairly recently, when that was remembered, April the 12th, 1945, by the Canadian Army. And I remember it well. I was only 5 years old, 5 years old. And I was so impressed by it that I always knew that when I grew up, I wanted to go to the land of my heroes, Canada. And I did. When I was 23, but 10 years of from when I was 13 till I was 23. I worked in the furniture factory, but then also worked for the largest importer of lumber in Holland and spent time in Sweden. So my life was about lumber manufacturing. Everything to do with that was my life, in particular value-added manufacturing. So then the other dream that I had is to come to Canada. Started with nothing. I had $25.47, couldn't speak the language, didn't know soul, didn't have a job. But I did want to do, I wanted to build a mill. That was my dream. And so when I landed in Vancouver, went to the immigration office, fortunately there was a German fellow working there, told him what I wanted to do. 1965, July 65, go to Prince George. They're building pulp mills, and that's where the opportunities were.
Yeah.
So I came here with the idea of building a lumber mill, but in particular value-added manufacturing. I saw the timber here throughout the province, coastal, different than interior, but both of them unbelievable fiber here, because I'd seen it in Sweden and in other places. No worse than, in other cases, better than. The thing that amazed me the most, Rob, from the time that I came off the bus here, got the first job piling lumber, or cleanup man in one of the mills here, you know, the one in the BCR side. I own the property now, actually. It was called Netherlands Overseas, purely coincidental. I stood by that burner, and more than half of the log, this beautiful timber, was going up the burner. That's the way it was then.
Well, you know, it's important to tell the viewers too that when you see a logging truck go by and those logs on that back of the truck, only about 40% of that log gets produced into lumber. You know, the outside, when they take the cants off, that's about 35% of the log gets chipped. Yep. And about 15% is sawdust and planer shavings for you know, for cutting it up.
Yeah.
And then you get a little bit of the bark for energy that they use. But you know, from that period of time to now, you know, that was the development of value added, everything from pulp to pellets to bioenergy.
Yeah, and so it evolved from there. And then the next things that happened is that you know, the opportunity was actually created by Ray Williston, who was the MLA for Prince George South, who was a Minister of Forest for nearly 16 years, had an amazing amount of impact on the forest industry in the interior and throughout the province, for that matter. And so what they had, and the mayor then of Prince George, Harold Moffat, and some other people, you know, at one point told him that, you know how much wood lumber we recover from a tree? And he said, well, probably 40, 50%. He said, no, only 25%. That's when most of that, and on the basis of that, then Ray Williston, in combination with Harold Moffat and some other industry, started approaching some of the larger producers, Canfor, you know, then one of the more active producers down the coast, you know, for investing in a pulp mill and sawmills here in northern British Columbia. And so they were one of the first ones with Reed on Prince George Intercontinental and PG Pulp, and you know, that we still have here now. And then from there on in, other companies got involved, Northwood, Noranda, on working on the pulp mills. So we had a very vibrant, active forest industry, and you know, so, and more mills were built. We had a mixture of independents and then some of the majors that evolved from there. And as you know, I'm in the process of writing a book I've been working on for well over 20 years. The benefit that I have is I was there 60 years ago in Cornell when the brothers of Ketchum brothers that became West Fraser started with their little mill. John Ernst, the first guy that used the chip and saw, that was the whole new combination. Nick Van Dremmelen and some of the, so I was part of that history and see it evolve, and it was amazing. But then what happened then?
It's never stopped evolving. You know, they always talk, you know, you go to a conference or something like that and they'll say it's, you know, times are changing. Well, I don't think they've ever stopped changing for you, you know, from 1960s when there was, what, 700-800 sawmills in this region to what are there now?
Up to 1,200 sawmills here.
And now we're down to, what, 5 or 6?
If that.
Yeah.
You know, so then the other part is, and the reason for the conversation that I believe is so important, as people sit there and belaboring what is happening, what went wrong, and why all of a sudden, you know, and that's the feeling that I had. When I first came here, we have this amazing forest, coastal, different than the interior, but at the same level as as Sweden has, you know, that are very, very successful in a lot of areas. But we have had so much timber that it would take genius to screw it up.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, we came close to that right now to do that.
Well, was it 2010? The provincial harvest was close to about 90 million. And then as recent as 2018, the government, you know, after the mountain pine beetle, the government's forecast was always about, you know, 50 million, 52 million. And yet in the budget that they came out with in February, they forecast about 32 million cubic meter harvest for the province.
So let's put that into perspective. So again, for the people that are maybe not be familiar. So one of the things that happened is that there's another thing that was amazing to me in the early 70s, you know, that we had primarily SPF, spruce, pine, balsam fir, you know, but the pine, which represented probably close to 30% of the forest, was not utilized at all because it was considered to be a weed.
Yeah, yeah.
So it only started in the early 70s when they started harvesting that. And then the other part that happened is the pine beetle. It started in the early 80s. Spruce pine beetle in the Bowren region started because of a bug investment in a park they could not touch, exploded from there in the region, and then obviously the pine beetle epidemic started in the Tweedsmuir Park and then kind of grew and probably eliminated, what would you say, 80% of the...
Well, no, I think it was about 60% of the merchantable timber, pine timber in the interior. You know, and the thing is, it's spread now into Alberta, although it's kind of crashing in the Alberta and into the prairies, mainly because it's more mixed.
How much would you say was affected? 1 billion board feet?
Oh,
a billion cubic meters?
Easily, yeah.
Yeah, easy. And now, what does a billion cubic meters mean? To me, that means if the average cut is 60 million cubic meters annually in BC, it equals the volume of 16 years of average cutting. And so the effect of it was that where the annual allowable cut used to be
about 90 million. Or it was uplifted to about 90. I think it was what, 70
but normally it was around 60, 70 steadily, and then it was calculated on the basis of, that was the whole logic behind it, is that how do we call an annual allowable cut, AAC, that then would regenerate and the volume of timber would not go down, it will remain steadily. That's how the program worked.
Yeah. Well, they had it, you know, say the annual allowable cut, which is the sustainable harvest level that is determined through timber supply analysis and a bunch of computer models based on assumptions. You know, the government was faced with, well, we have all this dead wood. So we can either harvest it or it's going to fall over and, well, we can harvest it and replant, or it'll fall over and regenerate slowly by itself, or it'll burn.
And that was the logical way of going about it. So it created this major push in uplifting the annual allowable cut to deal with the economic viability of the fiber that was dying. And so they did that. And then, you know, now the other thing that I believe is significant looking back, and where your company has been very, very involved in as well. Up to the mid-80s, we were not very good at reforestation of the forest because, all due respect to government, is that government is not good at these kind of things, and so they turned it over to industry to do the reforestation, and again making sure that the NSRs, not sufficiently reforested lands, had been replanted. And a lot of people say, well, we're not planting enough forest. Well, we do.
We planted about, a couple of years ago, it was as high as 300 million trees per year.
Yeah.
Now it's dropping a little bit, but the interesting part there is as the harvest levels have declined over the last 8 to 10 years, the number of trees that we've been replanting until very recently has increased. So there have been, the forest companies have been increasing their stocking density, partly because it was a transition from pine, which the trees come back naturally, to harvesting in spruce balsam stands, where there's a lot more brush competition. So the forest companies want to minimize their risk, because they're responsible for regeneration and achieving a healthy green stand with a minimum number of stems per hectare after the fact. So they actually, as they transitioned to spruce stands on steeper slopes where there's more brush, they started increasing their planting density.
Right.
It's just now, so last 5-10 years, the number of, the harvest has declined. The area harvested has declined, mainly because of the mountain pine beetle, and but seedling planting has actually increased, which has been really good for my company.
Yeah, because that's one of the things that you do as well. And so, but it likely means that the AAC is recalculated every 10 years.
Yeah, roughly.
Yeah, and readjusted to the reality. It likely means that before we get back to 60, 70, 80, or 60 million cubic meters annually, that it will take 40, 50, 60 years.
Yeah, probably at least 40 years.
At least 40 years.
If we ever get back there.
If we ever get back there. So what has that meant on the ground? All these kind of things, reduction of annual allowable cut. What else has happened is that there has been more involvement by government of the annual allowable cut is one number, but the annual allowable cut you cannot get it harvested unless you have cutting permits.
Yeah, and well, not just cutting permits. So, for our company and for a lot of the work that I did and still do, over the last 10 years, there's been a lot of requests from clients to say, well, for the forecast, what's the harvest level? How much lumber production is going to be out of BC? What's the residual chip supply? And in the past, when you do the allowable annual cut calculations, it was a mathematical, determination based on biological and factors that you could model. What's happened over the last few years, though, is that you're starting to put in a whole bunch of constraints on the land base where it becomes subjective. Caribou habitat is important.
So now we're talking about what you were saying earlier. The annual allowable cut can be calculated at 50 million cubic meters annually, but it is only at 30 million cubic meters, and the more I see about it, it may be even south of that, meaning even less. Why the difference?
So there's, and that's where the government would say, as a result of Canfor shutting down, that, they're shutting down because of economics. Lumber prices right now are very low, but pulp prices are very high. It's not because of the economics. The companies aren't determining that, hey, we're going to shut down a mill simply because a cyclical price has declined. They're shutting down simply because there is uncertainty with regard to their wood supply.
Yeah.
And where's that uncertainty coming from? It's, the harvest level, the AAC is still high, like we just said, is close to 50 million.
Yeah.
The government thinks the harvest might only be 32 million. So why is the gap? It's because uncertainty, ultimately it's uncertainty. Caribou habitat, what does that mean? Carbon capture, there's a whole bunch of companies that are interested in converting some of the area that they would normally harvest and say, well, we want to put it into carbon. There's old growth, it's still the old growth areas that they want to preserve. It's still part of the timber harvesting land base and still part of the annual allowable cut, but you're not allowed in there. all of these kind of factors put
Yeah.
a wrench into getting what, like you said, the cutting permits. If you
Or,
can't,
or the certainty by investors of
Yeah.
access to fiber, right?
yeah.
So just want to step back a little bit here. In around 2005 in BC, coast and northern in interior period, BC had about 120 sawmills. Right now it's less than 60. And still going down. We had some more announcements that we already talked about. I believe we'll see another 5 or 6 alone in the interior.
Could be,
in my opinion.
I think it might be a little closer to 10, or the equivalent of 10.
Yeah.
You know, because they remove shifts. That's what the companies
Yeah.
have been doing.
So anywhere between 5 and 10. And then the other part is that, okay, how does that affect pulp mills? Well, the multiplier is very simple because of what you already said. For every 5 sawmills that go down, you shut down the pulp mill. Approximately.
Yeah, yeah.
And then it will affect pellet plants. And, you know, so
So that's the value added, you know, where you come in. If you don't have these sawmills operating, how are you going to operate, or the pellet facilities?
the industry has to work all together, you know. So you have the annual allowable cut, which is predictable. It has to be. Otherwise, you cannot ask people to invest. And if there are challenges like we have had, you know, where because of the pine beetle, that it reduced the annual allowable cut. Other things that happened is First Nations, so, and we'll talk about that a little bit more as well, but it reduced the annual allowable cut. Then we have to look at what else can we, correct me if I'm wrong, you and me are sitting here representing the best interest of the people of British Columbia, because ultimately it's their timber, First Nations and the people of British Columbia. So that then being said is saying, why is it, and we have talked about it already a lot, I look at Sweden, you know, that have the same land base that we do, about 22 million hectares, you know, and that's the amount, right?
Yeah.
Is it? Yeah, slightly over 22 million hectares. The, you know, so, but their yield per hectare are much higher than ours. Why? Their species very similar to ours is because intensive forestry. They thinning their bush or their ownership
Their
of
climate's a little bit different, even though they're the elevation, they get the, you know,
but
it's more like coastal BC.
Yeah, somewhere in that
Yeah,
area, right? But the, you know, but that then being said, that may that be a benefit. But correct me if I'm wrong. You're a registered professional forester, you know. But from what I've seen is that we have to manage the forest to bring it to a free-to-grow state, and the more we can do in thinning, the more likely it is that the yield per hectare will increase.
Well, no, the thinning, and there's a big push on right now by the forest companies to do commercial thinning. And what commercial thinning does is it doesn't move the annual allowable cut higher, but it moves some of that volume sooner. Because what you're doing is really taking commercial logs out of the forest that are otherwise going to just die just through natural processes over the next 10, 20 years as the forest self-thins.
Okay.
So they just, you know, especially for the pulp mills, they want to capture that. The problem is that the government puts such constraints on, you know, the age and the structure of the stand that you can't find, you know, even though there's lots of candidates, it doesn't fit within their envelope of it has to be this, 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 and this. I'm not the expert. We have a couple of guys at our company that do that kind of stuff, but you know, the information I get from some of the licensees is that the difficulties and the bureaucracy put in place with respect to commercial thinning is such that very little of that happens. And then if you do get it, and you're in a timber supply area, you want to be able to commercial thin and then go back and capture the rest of that stand in 20 years. But there's no mechanism to ensure that you get access to that. So you might take a bit of a loss, you know, the harvesting it the first time, but somebody else might get the stand the second time just because of our
that
stand
brings
structure.
us back to tenure, right?
Yeah.
So that if you have tenure, what is tenure? Tenure is where you have an annual cut perpetually. Is it perpetually? Is there a limit?
Well, the belief was always, it was, for the replaceable forest licenses, that it was perpetual.
Yeah.
The government has now put a bunch of policies in place that they can take it back and not even really pay you fair market value, because their interpretation of fair market value isn't really economically based the way forest companies, or if you were and I were negotiating a price for.
So there it was believed by the tenure holders. We have haves and have-nots. I'm a have-not.
Yeah.
So just to know for the perspective, is that perpetual access to timber. Let's assume that that is the case, but with it go certain obligations. In terms of proximity or potency. That means it should be harvested in the region.
Yeah, that was up until about 2002 or 3.
Yeah, when Campbell came in, and he changed that rule, as well as eliminated the value-added sector for all intents and purposes.
So until recently, the replaceable forest license gave a forest company the belief that they had a secure fiber supply predicated on the annual allowable cut. And what's changed is now the government's intention is to reduce those forest licenses and give that volume to the First Nations, and that's and so that creates a lot of uncertainty, because you take away again 15-20% of your harvest and you give it to the First Nations. Well, how do you know that nation isn't going to give it to to your competitor, or decide not to harvest any of the wood themselves?
Okay, one step back then, talking about the thinning and managing the forest, that if you have a forest license that is volume based, then there is no particular incentive on the part of the one that is managing or taking forest from that area to put capital in, because somebody else will benefit from it. Why would they?
So they would just focus on what the legislation said as far as the minimums, the minimum stocking levels and minimum
not go
management.
beyond that. Which was to my point is that if we had area-based tenure, then the likelihood is more money will be invested in harvesting and growing of timber. That's pretty much proven by people like Dunkley that have small licenses and some other ones. So that is the one, and that would likely benefit in a way. And then the other part is that First Nations, by law now and by the United Nations designation,
Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People, which BC adopted.
Adopted means that a couple of things, that First Nations needs to be consulted. It used to be on any investments or changes that are made, but now it has changed, must give consent to changes that are being made. Plus, they have access to a portion of the annual allowable cut. What is it, 12%?
Well, that's increasing. The intention is to get up to 20%.
Up to 20%.
That's the government's intention.
So if that were the case, and we look again at the 50 million cubic meters that used to be as part of government, the Ministry of Forest, and then tenure holders, that likely will be reduced by 10 million, 20%. Now we got 40, and then.
But just because it's been reduced to give to to First Nations doesn't mean it's still not available. The problem is that it's uncertain, and it comes back to the uncertainty. So you get let's say I'm running a forest company, and I want to access a valley which some First Nation has control of that, the tenure in that, or the rights to that area. Well, I have to build a road and possibly a bunch of bridges in there, and that's and so I get my I spend $4 or $5 million to build a forest road, put my bridges in, but there's no certainty that I'm actually going to be able to harvest in there, because that's a couple of years down the road before first I got to get the road permit. That's going to take me a year dealing with government.
You have to invest in a mill.
Yeah.
$200 million or whatever it is. Any mill investment is 150 to 300 million dollars, whatever. So that is the one portion. Then the other portion, I had it out here earlier, is that the old growth, and has been, and then government did a study on that, had it done by, I believe this is the one. Correct me if I'm wrong. Yeah. I took it with me because
they identified
two of the people that we know well.
Yeah, they identified a couple 2 million some odd hectares of
2.7 or so, 2.5
of old growth, and then just and those areas, a lot of that area still contributes to the annual allowable cut. You're just not allowed to get into them. So a lot of those areas that were identified through that exercise were in areas where the licensees had cutting permits. All of a sudden, they couldn't harvest anymore, especially BC timber sales, which is the market pricing system we have here.
So it kind of created again more uncertainty and predictability. And then we had the other one is that the surrendered lands that they had already. Blueberry is an example of that, I guess. In northeastern British Columbia, we had a large port of timber that already was in the system.
The Northeast until about 2020 was the one bright spot, I guess you could say, where the forest companies were investing heavily.
And the bright spot simply means clarity, right?
Well, clarity, but also a fiber supply, because they weren't impacted by the mountain pine beetle to the extent of the rest of the province.
So they could look at that as that is the foundation they require because of whatever circumstance, that timber would be available to a conversion plant that they have. So it predicts it. Looking for.
And then in 2019, 2020, the government and First Nations came out with their plans for caribou habitat protection, which and they I think they rolled it out in Chetwynd back at that time, and there was a fairly large public outcry, but ultimately it led to Canfor Chetwynd shutting down that sawmill about a year ago, simply because you have to identify a large area for caribou habitat protection. Well, all of a sudden the fiber supply supporting that sawmill is gone. And then now you have the blueberries doing the same. They've identified, they won a court case against the provincial government on their treaty rights, and consequently they've identified large areas that Canfor's Fort St. John mill and the Louisiana Pacific's OSB plant rely on areas north of Fort St. John for harvesting, and a lot of that area is now inaccessible.
So that all being said, Rob, is as I said earlier, there is an election in BC, October the 19th. I'm not political, so
But you can hope.
So at least we had the intentions paper, right? And that was then Premier John Oregon put companies on notice. I think it was the Coffee Convention of 2019 in Vancouver, but he basically said he wants to see more participation by First Nations. I support that, and where he indicated old growth controversial. I do to a certain extent, but I don't agree as how far it did go and why, and that it was so involved anyway. So by other stakeholders that anti-logging period. And so, and the other one was value-added manufacturing. I spoke to that, believing that we were going in the right direction. obviously.
But in that regard, and I know you and I have talked a few times before, but the value added, from my perspective, the government has to, they recognize that the harvest level is going down. They're conserving more area for old growth. They're giving more tenure to First Nations. Where's the opportunity for them to create jobs? Because everything is negative with regard to the forest industry. We used to be 100,000 jobs in forestry in BC.
Yeah.
We were down to 50,000 a couple of years ago. I think we're down probably about to 40,000 now.
Yeah.
And the trend is to continue to lose jobs.
And those are direct jobs.
Yeah. So the only opportunity that the government has to say, to politically say, hey, we're going to create some opportunity or create some jobs, is to go to value added. But they seem to be ignoring the fact that value added only works if you have a solid, primary sector, which is what you rely on. Without a primary sector and the trim blocks that you need to create, your finger joints, you're not going to operate.
I've been in business in my value-added plant. I was sole owner, largest value-added plant in Canada most of the time, is that we employ probably 400 people. I don't get a nickel from government. I don't want nothing from them. Simply give me reasonable access to fiber at market prices. That has been the biggest challenge. And then the intentions paper in regards to value-added, they want to COFI and have COFI represent the industry, which it simply doesn't. COFI represents a couple of big sawmills that have most of the timber and have no interest really in other competitors, potential competitors.
Yeah.
I'm being somewhat critical of COFI because I was with them for 40 years, and
well, they were, they're serving their membership, which is primarily not their whole membership.
Two companies,
but the sawmilling sector.
No, they don't. They represent the ones that pay the most.
Okay.
That's the way it is.
Yeah.
And I'm not being clear, but that's the way it is. And so the.
But interestingly, there are a lot of companies have been leaving COFI,
because of that reason.
Interfor left, Teal Jones recently, although for other reasons.
Brink left. Yeah. I left because I had a strategic difference with them about the direction. The other thing that I was very involved in, saying if we look forward, my opinion has always been, we must have a viable primary sector. Otherwise, we will not have anything else. Secondary manufacturers cannot survive or be in business unless we have a healthy primary sector. I've been saying that right from the beginning. What should it then look like as we go forward? Well, there'll be less super mills, there'll be smaller mills, sawmills that will be operating more in the regions, working on forest in that region, and 100% of the lumber that they manufacture, 25% of the high grades go up the value chain, and 25% of the lower grades go up the value chain, and either that is done by them or in strategic relationship with others or by independence. As much as we can should be done here. So that was my belief. On the basis of that, I was involved, and even in those negotiations, I always took my cap off as the vice chair of COFI and saying, I'm here as an independent and value-added manufacturer. COFI didn't support that much, and actually they're one of the first majors that came to that meeting saying, the timber belongs to us, and nobody's going to tell us where we sell the lumber, no matter what the price is. Yeah. I said, well, may as well leave. And then the other part that was not so good is that the Deputy Minister of Forest gave assurance to COFI that there would be no transfer of timber. Yeah. And so when they told me that, I said, I got to leave.
And they did transfer, what, 600,000?
No, there was already 1.2 million left over in the CAD 2 program.
Yeah.
And they cut it in half to 600,000 cubic meters.
Which isn't even one well, it's the size of one mill.
It's an insult, right?
And to distribute that over the whole province.
So my view was this, is that, that I believe that the primary sector would benefit from working, not handouts, not subsidies, working with viable secondary manufacturers would benefit them and would benefit the industry. Unfortunately, it didn't go that way, and I put my finger directly at government and the other part in terms of the question then becomes, Rob, and that's likely why we and the interesting part is that, and I'm working on my book, and so I do a lot of research, and H.R. Macmillan, who was the founder of Macmillan Bodell, the largest forest company in the world at the time on the coast, and also he was the forest consultant or the forester for British Columbia when he was 26.
Chief Forester. Yeah.
Chief Forester of British Columbia. When he was 26, H.R. Macmillan made these comments in 1955, and I quote, "It seems obvious to me that as long as control of our forest land remains in the hands of politicians and bureaucrats, honesty, fairness, and sound judgment in the future of our province will continue to take a backseat to power and greed." That's a quote from him.
So what the government is proposing now is it's not going to be one government that the forest industry is going to be dealing with. It's 207 governments. So adds a little bit more uncertainty. But but if you have a good relationship with the First Nations in your backyard, it removes that uncertainty.
Yeah,
it's just that transition.
That's a fact we cannot change, right? So, but then I would say that it is obvious that is an industry in crisis, and a lot of it is because of forest policy.
Yeah.
And so that then it becomes a question that forest policy is not only the province of British Columbia, but also government, if you wish, of First Nations together, and they must find cohesion to work together in saying, how can we establish predictable forest policy going forward, 10, 20, 30, 40 years, that works for us both. Because if they don't, then we will continue to have an industry that will not have certainty or predictability and leave the province and invest elsewhere.
Yeah, and if you were a First Nation or representing a First Nations and all of a sudden you were provided this, would you trust the government to provide you the framework and the future with respect to fibre supply and everything else that they're trying to impose or provide you? That's so from an industry perspective, that's the problem that I think they're facing is that you're dealing with the provincial government, you're dealing with a lot of First Nations governments. A lot of them are probably better to deal with than with the provincial government, but there's still that uncertainty.
But let's talk about that, Rob, is that every 4 years we got an election in BC. It goes either to the left or the right, and it has these extremes on both sides. And then they appoint a minister of forest that, with all due respect, really most of the time doesn't know a whole lot about the forest industry. And then after midterm, about 2 years, they appoint a new one that becomes the minister, and then you have a new premier. So there is no predictability, and I think as a province, as the public of this province, including communities, we have to demand that there have been 3 royal commissions. Sloan Commission in 1945, another one in 1955, and then the Pierce Commission in 1976. All of them basically identified the same areas of problems. And so we must put, if we want to go forward and attract capital and investors and entrepreneurship, we must give reasonable predictability to access of fibre. Both governments, First Nations and the BC government, must be able to supply that. If they are not, they will not attract capital. Yeah. Why are we so different from Alberta?
Well, Alberta is a little bit more their government's more economically focused. I don't think their tenure system's all that different from ours. It's just, the other big thing is the First Nations all are under treaty in Alberta, whereas British Columbia never had treaties with their First Nations other than in the Northeast. Yeah, and in McLeod and a few, everything, the Northeast of BC. But that's the big difference is a focus on economics in Alberta by the provincial government and the First Nations operating under treaties.
In 2005, I bought a plant just north of Calais in Crossfield, Palliser Lumber. The plant was, by far it is the largest value-added manufacturer in Canada. We had the operations here in Prince George, Vanderhoof, Houston, and one or two grow and expand even here. And, and so the day after I bought it, I got a call from the Minister of Natural Resources, because that forest falls under that. And he said, "John, welcome you to Alberta, and what can we do?" And I thought, oh my God, this has never happened to me. Not in. And so I said, I'd like you to come down next week and for a day so I can take you through the operation, show you what we want to do. And he said, "What day works for you?" I said, Wednesday. So he said, "I'll be there Wednesday morning." And he spent all day with me. In the 50 years that I've been here and being one of the largest employers, I saw the premier of this problem drive right by my plant. And maybe they don't like me much because I've been, what I think, constructively critical at some of the things. And so is that one of the problems that we have, is rather than looking inward and saying, capital, you cannot capture capital and say you must stay here. If they cannot justify the investment and that there are opportunities elsewhere, that's where they're going to go. And
that's where the BC mills have been. They've got all their capital's been flowing to the southern U.S.
or Finland, or Sweden, or Alberta, for that matter. And again, Jamie Pattison is the controlling shareholder, 51%, I believe, of Canfor, and probably 12 or 13%, the largest shareholder in West Fraser. I have a great deal of respect for Jimmy Pattison, but how can you blame them when you sit around the boardroom table and you have to justify as to where do you invest in capital? And then for a value-added manufacturer, for ourselves, unfortunately, that when they had the intentions paper letting us believe that they potentially would make available fiber so that you have some negotiating, bargaining room, they took away half of that was there already.
A lot of meetings and nothing to gain from it.
But it was a joke. So they already had decided, that nothing would happen, and then they had to go through the process to make it look like there was. And we're okay, so that it is what it is. So the question then becomes, Rob, that is so important in my mind: what do we do collectively? I agree, and I've said always that in order to have viable primary manufacturing, that's what you must have first. But then in order to have that, there must be a reasonable access to globally competitive fiber into the plant, because the industry is a global industry. And if we price ourselves out of the market by the cost of fiber, then we will not be competitive.
And we're not competitive now. Like even at the COFI conference, there was the analyst for Raymond James, Daryl Schweitzkopf. He put a chart up on the board and said, BC had the least, of all the jurisdictions across North America, was the highest cost producer of lumber, simply because of the cost of logs, the softwood lumber tariff, distance to the market, and the bureaucracy that we have to accommodate in order to get the cutting permits. And I think the government's actually recognized that that's the bottleneck in the whole system, because they, in early this year, they allocated what's that Andrew Mercer, so they're recognizing that they've created an environment that doesn't allow the logging companies or the forest companies to operate because they can't get cutting permits in place.
Yeah, but that is just one little piece.
It's one
piece, has to go further than that.
That's
the forest policy that we have is flawed and it's in crisis. I believe the fellow, what's his name again, that writes the...
Dave Elstone.
Yeah. And he's very good. I recommend to our listeners to sign up with them. It is On the Stump. Very
View from the Stump. Yeah.
View from very good. Yeah. But he said in his opening, the British Columbia forest industry is collapsing. Yeah. That's what he wrote. Very well done.
Yeah, David doesn't pull any punches. He there's no hidden agenda there. He just calls it the way he sees it.
And the other part that I was going to say about value-added manufacturing, like ourselves being there for 50 years, we don't get any logs. The whole allegation behind the justification of duties by the U.S. government is that it is alleged that we subsidize our primary manufacturing sector, so therefore duties, but they through the secondary manufacturing sector in it automatically. Yeah. We were able to change that when I was the founding president of the BC Council of Value-Added Wood Processors, where it be charged on the input. That was eliminated when the last, Kofi actually negotiated the last deal on behalf of the government of British Columbia, didn't include value-added, was not in their agenda. So now we are paying full duty on our value add. Yep. So the more value you add, the more duties you pay. For Brink, since 2017, we have paid over $70 million in duties that we should not have paid to start with. But it's simply, again, a government not at the one hand saying we want value-added manufacturing, and really it's all...
I think you fell through the cracks and weren't a priority for them.
No, and that's basically what it is. So what is left of the value-added sector from 2000? Less than 1/3 of the value-added sector is remaining, and less all the time. Talking now, looking for, because I'm a positive individual, you are, I am. Looking forward, we still have immense potential, in my opinion. We must look at what I like to see here. We have the University of Northern British Columbia and the Prince George region. We have the College of New Caledonia. I want to see a center of excellence where we create trades for a changing, not only forest industry, but for all the opportunities that are here. Our biggest challenge has been for the last 50 years in my company is finding the trades. And obviously now with the curtailments, unfortunately, that probably in the short term trades are available, but in the longer term there aren't, and I believe that's one of the things that we have to do.
Yeah, there's I hear you're saying you're an optimist. Right now I'm a pessimist in the short term. I think, like we said earlier, there's going to be a number of more mills shut down. In the end, it's going to be a smaller industry, but it's, for the ones that are left that can survive this transition to more First Nations inclusion and hopefully a better constructive working relationship between, the provincial government and First Nations, and the rebuild of that trust. But that's still, in my view, it might be a decade away. If the industry is half, then, and if we got, say, 40 sawmills in the interior and we go down to 30, if you're one of the survivors, you're going to be in a pretty good position, simply because 10-15 years ago, BC was providing about 15% of the lumber to the U.S. that they needed on an annual basis.
Yeah, and that's about 10 billion
Yeah, well, we were as high as 16 billion board feet.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now we're down to about 8 billion, and
or less,
and probably declining to 6 billion.
Yeah.
So if you're a U.S. Consumer of lumber, that's going to tighten things up quite a bit in the U.S. South.
Yeah. The other point, Rob, that I think again looking back, but looking forward, is that one of the best areas for the forest industry, although smaller, is still in the interior around the area of where we are. And then northern BC, further, the cost of fiber from there is too high. It was extremely unfortunate from a long-term economic perspective that the then Campbell government, the BC Liberals, they call them, gave away the CN, the railroad to Fort Nelson. If we had that today, we could benefit from that and getting fiber into the marketplace from northern BC. I still believe that we still have some of the best locations, access to market, Asia, North America, Europe.
Yeah.
And the best infrastructure, looking at air, road, rail, and all the other things to make us successful in the marketplace. We just have to look at the government of the day is saying the system is not working, and I think back at what H.R. Macmillan said 70 years ago in 1955. That's the comments that he made. Yeah. And saying, not much has changed. Is that, that politicians and bureaucrats, that if they make decisions about policy, and I'm not alleging anything,
I think they're part of their problem rests in the fact that most of those guys making decisions in policy have never operated their own company or understand the economics that inspire a decision one way or another. And so for them, it's all theoretical, and for them, whether it's 1,000 jobs or whatever, it's just a number for them.
Whatever, right? Yeah, and that is extremely unfortunate. Hopefully, at some point, the people are going to stand up and say, we need change. Yeah. And whatever that looks like, I'm not sure. If I look again at politics, I want to be an optimist, and that has me worried about it. So.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so,
that being said then, Rob, where do we go?
Don't ask me, where do we go from here? I don't know if there's we're on a path here, and I'm not sure if there's a change.
I say to my wife, as long as we're healthy.
Yeah. Even for our company, it's going to be different, and it's going to change, and we grow 20 million seedlings a year, and my gut feel is that it'll be reduced a little bit, and potentially a few greenhouses and nurseries might shut down in the interior. Even with Trudeau, he's got his 2 billion tree initiative. Where are they going to plant that? And that happened 4 years ago, and 2 billion trees in 10 years. Right. Yeah, it's. I think they make a big announcement when they plant a million trees.
So in your company, though, because you are the expertise in your company right from 1952 forward, 80 years nearly. Are you doing internationally a lot of work? And
well, not so much for the international clients. It's mainly if they're interested in investing in BC. Actually, we worked with Mondi when they invested in Alberta.
Yeah,
they were pretty positive, but they were not. They looked at some of the BC facilities that were for sale at the time, and they said, "No, that we'll stick with Alberta."
Yeah,
better certainty on the on fiber supply, and and Mondi ended up purchasing the West Fraser Hinton pulp mill.
Yeah,
so. Yeah, we've had others, again, looking at, I'm trying to understand the fiber situation in BC, or it's the Americans asking, what's the outlook for lumber production in BC? And so it's usually in that context that we provide information.
Now, the other thing that is worrisome, if you look at the U.S. Southeast, where a lot of, up to 20 sawmills have been built there in that region, but again, they added close to, making changes to existing mills and new mills, close to 7 billion board feet annually, and it kind of puts it in danger to overproducing and affecting pricing.
Yeah, and that's what they've seen now with the huge drop in prices. At the same time, most of those, and they're finally losing a little bit of money in those jurisdictions.
But
they're not used to that, but they've got some of the cheapest sawlog prices in North America, simply because the sawlogs grow there in 25 years, whereas for here it's 65 years.
Yeah, exactly.
So they had a huge surplus of standing inventory that they had to dispose of.
But less so now,
Yeah.
So so I still, looking at reduction likely, in manufacturing, less so in the interior because of fiber around us, but still too much capacity at this point, even on the west side. Obviously the mills in the north have mostly are gone. Some more probably in the central British Columbia, Kootenays.
If you're in forestry, the only secure spot for you right now is in government.
Yeah.
Because you're dealing with 206 new governments, and they're building their capacity, and they've got questions, and they want to take a more active role in forestry. So there's opportunities in forestry. It's not going away.
So you just have to be able to identify it, right? And then find a way of saying, okay, these are the pieces that we cannot change. So what will it look like? How do we go about it as a company to adapt to changing circumstances?
And there'll be a sawmilling and pulping industry here. It's just going to be a little bit smaller.
No question about that. Rob, as always, it was a pleasure to have you, and a privilege, and we covered a lot of ground. And, and to our guests watching us from around the world, obviously forestry is a big question mark in BC right now, and an industry in transition and going through a difficult time. So Rob, as one of the experts in the field, and for myself, having been exposed to the forest industry in Holland and here in northern British Columbia for 60 years actually. It's an interesting time, but still I believe a time of opportunity, and I love Canada, I love British Columbia. In spite of it all, every time I fly around here, I say, my God, look at all the forests.
And pray for rain.
And pray for rain. And that's the other part I should mention as well. Global warming and all things associated with. We have some already early in this season, some forest fires, Fort Nelson in particular right now. And, we feel horrible about the people that had to leave their homes. And so I hope that we get rain, and that it will not become another bad year for forest fires. Thank you for having you on my podcast.
Been a pleasure being here.
Thank you. Thanks, Rob.
Thanks.